My name is Samir Shah. So therefore I'm going to be improvising. My task today, however, has been massively enlightened by the brilliance of the panel here who will be doing all the heavy lifting. Let me introduce them. Most of them actually don't need introduction. Let me begin with Alka Seghal Cuthbert. I'm very pleased that Alka is here because one of the areas I think we've been discussing, which has been slightly under-examined, and I hope we'll talk about it a lot, is the generational change that's going on. And Alka's experience as a teacher and her involvement in education and her current directorship of Don't Divide Us, I hope, will help us explore that more. John McWhorter doesn't really need any introduction. We heard him last night. A tremendous guest. I'm so pleased he's here. I'm honored that he's on this table. Welcome, John. And now Trevor, if anybody who doesn't need any introduction, is Trevor. I see in the write-up that Trevor's written down here as businessman. Should have been broadcaster, Trevor, but I actually think you should say Knight in the Realm. I think that's now.
Leave me alone.
Anyway, so let's kick off. We have a question up here, which isn't up here, but it says it's about the question of this session is how has the meaning of racism and equality changed? We've obviously touched upon some of these both last night in the first two sessions, but let's dig deeper into this and let's kick off with all of you. You've all been asked to prepare 5 to 7 minutes. So, Alka, would you like to kick off?
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you to the organisers and the providers of the space, and to you guys coming over from across the pond. It's fantastic to have this kind of conversation, much needed. Okay, so before I get into the race thing, I just quickly want to say something on data because it's really like a bugbear of mine, and it is related so central to the discussions on race today. Field. When I did my PhD just down the road here at the Faculty of Education, I was like the oldest PhD in town. Many were very young. And everyone was asking, it relates to your question, David, when are you going in the field? When are you going? This was before the University of Southern California decided field was racist. When are you going into the field, Alka? When are you going into the field? Oh, I'm going to the field. And I was like, I'm still doing my literature review. I'm in the library, mate. You know, I'm reading Emmanuel Kant. I'm reading Rousseau. I'm reading Ernst Cassirer. And I said, well, have you got your research question? I haven't got a bloody clue what my research question was. Because I was getting to know the fundamental assumptions of the discipline, which you need to come up with a decent research question. When you come up with a decent research question, you then work out which method is the best way to investigate that question. And it may be interdisciplinary, or it may be single disciplinary, etc. That whole long, painful, and believe you me, it is painful process, isn't just germane to the humanities, it's actually what scientists do. Something I didn't discover till I then looked at philosophy of science, when you realise that is in fact what scientists do. So, and data, in that sense, is crucial, but it is crucial not in providing reasons, because it can't do that. Reasons is a different category. Data helps us look for patterns across society. It helps us interrogate our assumptions and hypotheses. Yeah? It shows us where to look. And if done properly, that can be illuminating, but that is all it can do. So this idea of what does the data tell us, is incoherent, and it's misleading, and it's demeaning of human agency. So I just thought I'd want to get that out of the way. On to racism. Racism, let's start off with a working definition. Racial thinking, plus when it has institutional support, and it has affirmation, endorsement, from sources of cultural or political authority in society. That, to me, is what I would call a kind of loose working definition of classic or traditional racism. It developed its exquisiteness, if you like, in an ironic way, in the late 19th century, during a period of advanced industrial development. Today, I would argue that what has cultural endorsement, what has institutional backing, is not racism, it's anti-racism, right? And I just want to let that sink for a minute, right? Because think logically, what am I saying here? What I am saying is that today, Racism is dead. Long live racism in the form of anti-racism. Okay, that is what I'm saying. I'm saying it with some trepidation, but that is what I'm saying. I think it's what we need to get better at saying in more ways with more confidence. Enough caveats. Okay, I'm stopping myself consciously from saying, of course, racism exists. Right? As soon as you've said that, you have conceded the assumptions of social justice, EDI definitions of racism, because unfortunately they have won. They do own most of the cultural landscape and the power and authority in our cultural institutions. So we cannot do that. Okay? I think, however, the form of racism has changed, but the function remains the same. In my view, the function of racism has always been an apologia for inequality in advanced industrial countries, for the inability of these societies to deliver on what intellectually and ethically they promised. Liberty, equality, tolerance, those classic Enlightenment values. Historically, painfully, slowly, through struggles, they have been extended to more and more people, but they're still not universal in their application. And we're focused on the minorities, how this degrades and provides depredations for the minorities. We focus less on the fact that while this also limits the ability of majorities to exercise their rights. Okay? So in the past, the majority populations that had more democratic formal rights than the minorities may have been better off, if you like, more privileged than the minorities. But still, as long as they accepted those divisions, they were limited themselves in their capacity to exercise their full democratic rights. So, I think I know John is a linguist, and I think when new words appear in public discourse, it's always worth having a little think. So the supersession, is that the word, supersession?
It is now.
Yeah, okay, I've just made up a word, thank you. A supersession of equality with equity, I think, says it all, okay? I won't go into it now because of time, but we can go into it. I think, very simply, I think equity denies a fundamental sphere of equality, which is not to do with politics or economics or houses or school outcomes. It's not to do with any outcomes. It's to do with ontological being. And that is, in the sphere of morality, a slave is as equal as a king or the head of the World Economic Forum, if you like. Okay? We are equals. And if we break away from that, I want to say quite strongly, we are on the road to unravelling every single gain we've made over the last few centuries. Sorry, I know I'm saying big things here, but we can talk about it. Very quickly, some reasons why, not in any particular order of importance. The exhaustion of the post-war political arrangements and standards. In Britain, T.H. Marshall, one of the founding contributors of the welfare state, said at the time, "This is a temporary compromise. This will not last. We have to be aware of that." Okay. The Berlin Wall falling was, if you like, the biggest international public marker of his prediction. I think intellectual stasis, particularly amongst conservative thought, actually, as it happens, but now more widely, with a few exceptions, notable exceptions on both sides of the pond, Roger Scruton, Alan Bloom, etc., Christopher Lasch. There's been a defensiveness or a lack of interest. The conservative thinkers have not really taken culture or subjectivity that seriously. Okay, and I think that intellectual degradation is now much more profound and widespread. David, you were asking about the state of social sciences. You only have to look at the recommended reading lists of most sociology courses to see that many of them will not go back further than Foucault. If they've got Durkheim on there or Weber on there, they'll be only to decolonize them or to, trans them or something, whatever it is. It will be. So there's that intellectual degradation. there's been a sidelining of historical and sociological thinking and an emergence of kind of cod psychology thinking. Yeah? So what this means is that problems that are fundamentally in their character political or sociological are being recast in problems of individual psychology or, you know, problems of even epistemology. Now, the epistemological one makes more sense because knowledge does come into it. But I want to shout loudly the words of one of my favorite philosophers, Emmanuel Kant, who in the second preface to The Critique of Reason, says we do not enhance the sciences when we let, I'm paraphrasing, when we let them, you know, kind of run riot across everywhere, right? We disfigure them, and we do. And this is what we're doing today. This is really what we are doing today when we try and understand subjectivity or morality in the language of the natural sciences. So there's been that. And then I think finally, and this is where I think the work of Adolf Reed and Walter Ben Michaels, yeah, has some really interesting insights. You may not agree politically with them or other things, and I'm not an extensive scholar of their work, but what I have read, you know, is pointing to, for quite a long time in the sphere of economics, Glenn, you may know about this, people have been writing about the structural changes of the economy at worldwide level, financialization, the kind of global forms of management. Just anecdotally, I see this in the different, you know, the kind of what my relations in India are doing. You know, when I was growing up, they would never have the kind of things, opportunities they have now. They're going to Australia, they're going to America, they're coming to London, they're going to Scotland, and then they're staying for a while and moving on in their kind of jobs in a certain sector, right? So this is happening, and I think that's a good thing, by the way, but it comes at a cost, and I don't think we're having enough conversations about what the costs are. And I'm not saying that this, and I'm hesitant to mention it because too often it then gets reduced to a base superstructure thing. Is it the economy or is it culture? And it's not as simple as that. There's no immediate or direct read-off. But just look at some of the, you know, what does a global form of governance need? It needs transferable skills. You look at what transferable skills has done within the school curriculum. It's been a disaster, unmitigated disaster. It needs people who are willing to up and move. So you can't have rootedness. Rootedness becomes an obstacle to that. The liquidity, that lovely, what's his name? Who's the author? Berman. You know, the liquidity of modernity, the liquidity of money, of finance, kind of has echoes and resonates in a kind of social model of the individual that is emerging here. I think we need to be looking at this, and we need a language that I think, and from this we can hopefully create or begin to create the vision powerful enough that Aisha talked about, that draws on our fundamental values that are actually held tacitly by the majority of most people, normal people. That was Coleman Hughes' point, I think, earlier. Most people have these kinds of conversations. This is an elite project, right? And it is an elite project. It might not everybody who endorses it is part of the elite, for sure, but that's its source. So whether we like it or not, we need to take culture seriously. It's a war we need to fight, and we need to win it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. John.
What Alka said. I really can't, I can't do better than that. But I would want to have the opportunity to put a gloss on it, which is that I think we need to consider how peculiar our circumstances are in terms of what we're up against. Psychologists are familiar with something called the victimization mindset. That is a race-neutral concept. It's something that happens to human beings in all cultures. And the victimization mindset is one that exaggerates the degree of one's victimhood. It's most common among people who are not victims in any sense that most people would think. It's an elite, it's often an advantaged way of thinking. But you exaggerate your victimhood. The person who is under the victimization mindset tends to downplay even the obvious victimization of other people. And the person under the influence of the victimization mindset walks around constantly offended at their victimization not being sufficiently acknowledged. This is a kind of person. This is not a schoolyard taunt. This is the way that a modern human being might wind up. What we're seeing with the way race is discussed in America, especially among elites who then have a disproportionate influence on people who are not elites, is the victimization mindset institutionalized. What we're seeing is a particular way of being treated as a norm rather than as an aberration. And so what you have is a sometimes tacit and sometimes explicit idea that, for example, what gives you a challenge makes you weaker rather than what gives you a challenge makes you stronger. There is a tacit or sometimes not tacit idea that the world is divided between good and bad people, and that you're supposed to think along those lines. There's a tacit or sometimes not tacit idea that you're supposed to always trust your feelings. What I'm doing here is I'm recapitulating the tenets that Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt list in their really underread and underacknowledged book, The Coddling of the American Mind. And those three tenets are things that no normal person would instruct in their children, but which we're taught are somehow an important watch cry for groups of people and how we are to view groups of people. It's the institutionalization of that. And one thing that I think gets missed is how comfortable the victimization mindset is if you're not a victim. People choose this because it's a way of feeling good in the world. It's not people who are trying to seek power. That's only a small minority of the people in question. It feels good to pretend to be a victim in modern society. I've seen this all of my life. I wouldn't have known what vocabulary to put to it. But even back when I was a grad student at Stanford, this is 1990, May, the undergraduates responded to what anybody would have thought of as a very minor series of discrepancies. Black and Latino and Native American undergraduates in particular. And they chose it as an opportunity to take over the faculty administrative building, and a lot of them were put into a bus and taken downtown and arrested, et cetera. And I was much less interested in this sort of thing back then because I was trying to get a PhD in a subject that had nothing to do with race issues. But I remember watching this conflagration, because I didn't have anything to do that afternoon, and the thing that struck me was that the students being taken away to jail in the bus, none of them really spent any time there, but they're being taken away, the local news is there, is that they were all smiling. And I thought, if this is serious, why are they making all those faces? Why are they joyous? And then some of them were editorialists for the paper, the campus paper, and the next day, a week after, they were writing joyous editorials. And I thought, they're imitating what happened here in the 50s and 60s. But if you look at the black and white newsreels of Dr. King in Birmingham, no one is smiling. So why the joy? And it was the joy because they were adopting the victimization complex, and because they were affluent and fortunate kids, black though they were happy. And you see this again and again. You fast forward. I was a young professor at UC Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, and there was a conference thrown by the African American Studies Department when it became a PhD program. And there were people from all over the Bay Area, and there was, frankly, I wouldn't have said it out loud at the time, rampant, brilliant, articulate, and shameless exaggeration of the race situation in the United States in 1995. And even then, and I'm getting a little older, but I hadn't really spoken out yet, I noticed everybody here is so happy. Everybody here is so warm. There's a sense of warm fellowship in this room as people talk about their supposed victimhood. Now I know what that was. Any psychologist would know what it was. It's the victimization mindset and aberration having been adopted as a norm. And the thing is, this is quite unprecedented, I'm sure, in human relations. And by human, I mean Homo sapiens. I mean 300,000 years of this species. Has there ever been any society, any people, anywhere, and I don't just mean last week, I mean over the past 300,000 years, where the disadvantaged group wallows in victimhood even as it's passing? It's very peculiar, and yet the people in question are good people. they're not bad. They don't deserve to be made fun of, but you just wonder, why would anyone do this? And I think it's contingency. It's chance. We have to always leave room for the fortuitous in our sense of how social history goes. There are always things that are just because. If that asteroid hadn't hit 65 million years ago, the dinosaurs would have become more sophisticated and mammals wouldn't have become big and we wouldn't be here. If you look at an old cartoon character, often they're wearing gloves. Why? Why does Bugs Bunny wear gloves? The reason that Bugs Bunny wears gloves is because early cartoon characters were based on minstrel stage performers who often wore gloves. That's why Mickey Mouse wears gloves. Why doesn't he just have hands? Chance is the way these things go. In this, I think that the victimization mindset has become so popular, partly because of the vast success in America and beyond in prescribing racism, so that you have a dominant class who are ready to embrace and support people who are taking the victimization mindset too far by acknowledging that they understand what racism is. And then I think we've seen what's really happened lately because of the peculiarity of social media. That story has not been written yet. We're still living it, but in 2009, everything changed. It wasn't so much 2020 as 2009. That's becoming a distant time, but 2009 was the year where it went from what's Twitter to, oh, you're not on Twitter. It was also that year that your mother was on Facebook, that year, 2009. And next thing you know, social media is everywhere, and I live in it myself. But that means that an aberration of this kind, especially if it's so attractive, if it gives you such a feeling of warmth and belonging, can spread faster and matter than it would have had any way to do otherwise. It used to be that you would have had to read a magazine article. That's not going to have the effect of articulate and ongoing tweets in particular. And so we're dealing with something extremely unprecedented, extremely peculiar. And in order to get past it, there are all sorts of suggestions that we can discuss. But I think that we have to understand that so often what we're dealing with is not the way it has to be. And so the cartoon characters don't have to have gloves. Black America and beyond doesn't have to wallow in victimhood idly in the way that it does. And our academic culture and our activist culture, there's another way that it could be. I see no reason why academia has to be so focused on documenting racism and racist inequities and submitting all of that to chi-square analysis, as opposed to studying something which I would think all thinking people would be equally interested in, which is, how have people gotten ahead amidst the challenges of a stratified and economically unjust society? How have people gotten beyond it, and how might we bring that to scale? That is surely as worthy an academic project as chronicling once again how things aren't fair. It stuns me in a way that people with PhDs aren't sloveringly interested in that question and wanting to share it with the world. Too often, that sort of thing, at least in the United States, is shared in wonderful books, such as by Ian Rowe, who must be here, or there was a wonderful one written, unfortunately, it was actually in 2009 by Bill Cosby, and now, well, so we can't use his book, Come On People, anymore. But there are these books that actually outline how you can get beyond the injustices. And they don't get enough attention, partly because they're not seen as having the imprimatur of people who lead the academic culture. That's not fair, but that's just the unfairness that there will always be. Our thinking class must concentrate more on sharing how people have gotten beyond the worst, because that's the way human beings have worked throughout the history of the species. So that's what I have to add to this.
Okay. Trevor.
Thank you very much, Samir. It's a privilege to be on stage with you both, and particularly with you, John. I want to follow up the, I suppose you could call it, the Manichaean framework you've just laid out.
I would call it that.
Thank you. Okay, sorry, we speak Greek. The Manichaean framework you've just laid out. But actually, the last point you made, I think, it's extremely important in relation to the academy. A long time ago, when I had a lot of government money to spend, and I wanted to spend a lot of it on research, as chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, I think in 1 year we must have bunged out getting on for £3 or £4 million in research grants. I wanted somebody to do research on, and this has been mentioned earlier on this morning, the success of children of Chinese heritage, not just in this country, but in virtually every jurisprudence. Okay? It was bizarre. I could not get a single British higher education institution to take on the research project because the response was, if you want us to do that, it's an implication that other groups are going to be stigmatized. Literally, I was offering hundreds of thousands of pounds to people to do some research, couldn't get anybody. And to this day, by the way, I don't think anybody's actually done it in this country. And I also just wanted to say, I've got a great deal of affection for the institution that John works for, the Columbia University. We heard about social mobility this morning. My father started his life in America as an illegal immigrant and a security guard on Columbia University's campus. And not so long ago, my nephew graduated from the same building, it's a business school, as an Columbia MBA. That's social mobility, a point I'll come back to in a moment. I'm aware I'm the last speaker before lunch, so I am going to punish you. I am speaking, I can't at all compete with the sophistication of our academics. I'm basically a journalist who tries sometimes to deal with some of these concepts in a way that the moderately intelligent reader, and I'm talking about Times readers, might be interested in. And I say that because by and large, most people are not interested. Most people probably think they kind of know what they think about race, and it's a bit tiresome to be battered with it all the time. I also want to say a few words as chair of a business. There are people in this room who know it. We recruit at executive level. We put about 500 plus people every year into the boss class, board level appointments, CEOs, and so on. And more than half of them are women, more than 1/3 minority. And I make that point because I would just like us to remember that this conversation isn't just about how we talk about things. I think the point of talking about things is to work out what you want to do about things. And I want to come at the end of my remarks to 3 things that I suggest we should do. I share the concerns that have been expressed about the growing censorship as chair of Index on Censorship here. The thing I'm particularly concerned about, both as journalist and Index on Censorship, is something that I think was alluded to but not quite articulated earlier on, which is that the predominance of narrative over evidence has what I regard as an unexpected outcome, which is that we worry in the media particularly about not so much about what is said, but who is saying it. And it's led us to a rather peculiar position, at worst, a kind of speech apartheid in which different groups are permitted to say different things, not based on argument, but on who you are. I think in the jargon of the faculty lounge, they call it standpoint epistemology now. So I'm allowed to say and do things that my colleague at Sky, Sophie Ridge, is not allowed to say and do. I think this is even more worrying than the issues of cancellation. I also wanted to just commend, if I may, Sonia's point earlier on about institutional capture. One of the most worrying moments of my recent life has been going to meet a very senior civil servant. They don't get much more senior than this individual. And seeing him proudly carry a copy of Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, which is possibly one of the worst books written about anything ever in the universe. And proudly displaying it as evidence of his understanding of himself. Coming back to one of the points that were made earlier on, the biggest issue, and this is, I think, my take on Sonia's point, the grown-ups are leaving the room. That is happening in universities, It is happening in the media. It is increasingly happening in the private sector. That the people who should be saying, for Christ's sake, go back and do your job and stop. I know we're speaking, I've got to moderate my language here. Go and do your job, or go and study, get a first-class degree, and then do something useful instead of bothering me. They are basically saying, oh, really? Is that what I need to do? Can I just lie down so you can walk on me? I mean, this is insane. So what do we do about it? Well, part of it is, this session was originally about the language of race, and I want to say a few words about that. The most disappointing thing about public discourse on race and ethnicity in the West, to be honest for me, is how stale it's become. It isn't even, much of the language that we use isn't even particularly relevant in the United States anymore. Much of it is sophomoric, it's conservative, and ironically, the worst part of it is that most of it is Eurocentric. Today's language focuses on the oppressor as the active agent. Everybody else is an object of oppression, and it fails to recognize either the agency or diversity of minorities. So what do we want? Well, where I start, and John is the expert here, but I would always say language needs to be useful and intelligible. It is a great tool for human problem solving. What problems does it solve here? First of all, it helps us to acknowledge and articulate racial difference. I'm not going to get into what is racism. I don't care. Racial difference does matter so that we can have a common understanding of the frictions that arise in our society and a common set of ambitions for our diverse society. Second, we need language that can help us best negotiate across the lines of difference so that we can come up with common programs to minimize frictions and maximize the opportunities of our diversity. I think the mistake that people on all sides of this discussion sometimes make is to think that the role of the anti-racist is to make people better people. We are not priests. That's not our job. That's not what we do. What we should be doing when we're talking about these issues is to think about how we make our society operate more effectively and how we change people's lives for the better rather than worry too much about their souls. So I don't think we should get too fixed on the psychology of it. And one of the things I just want to say in this gathering, I do think that sometimes when this group, talks about these things, that we do tip over into a little bit of suggesting that there are no problems to be solved. Actually, that's just not the case. The answers that some people give is, in my view, the wrong answer. It is unhelpful, but that doesn't mean that there isn't discrimination or there isn't chronic disadvantage. The difference that I have with many people now is that the orthodoxy pretends that that's all there is to the nature of a diverse society. But there are real differences. And some of them, discrimination discussed, but some of them are to do with choice. And we have to understand how and why people make choices. Simple thing. In this country, fewer than 10% worship weekly, unless you're a Sikh, where it's 75%, or unless you're black, where it's over 50%. In the last session, we were talking about university choice. A very interesting thing here. There are lots of people from minorities who could go, and I think the point was made that somebody from minorities is more likely to go to university than the average, but they tend to go to non-research universities. They go to the ones that are, 50 to 100 on the league tables. One of the interesting things is people who could go to the top 10 universities choose to go to their local university. And there's some work being done in the United States about this. It's very interesting. People from minorities regard moving a long way away from their community or their families as a loss. It's a real material loss. That means they lose something and the society loses something. These are the kinds of problems that I think we need to think about. In the tight labour market and world where I work, one of the things that we know is that minority employees pose a big flight risk for big corporations. One of the reasons they pay us money to help them is to work out how to deal with all of those things. Now, I set these out really because I worry that we don't reduce this to an argument about bad, silly people who are doing bad, silly things in universities. The point about talking about racial difference is to do something about it. I think that we should focus on how we solve those problems. And by the way, I agreed very much with most of what Catherine said, but I disagreed with one thing. It is not the case, in my view, that people of Chinese and Korean heritage don't think about racial disadvantage. They think about it a lot. My family, I think most people here know I'm the 10th of 10 children. Most of my family lives in the United States. My sisters live in a place called Flushing, which used to be, I mean, it's part of the kind of immigrant way station for New York. Everybody's an immigrant lives in Queens at some point. Anyway, my sister lived in Flushing. I used to run up the street to a place called Casino Park, which was mixed, was black. You know it, right?
This is my neighborhood now.
Okay, in that case, you don't look Korean to me.
No,
but
I get that.
Yeah, okay, you're getting... The point I'm making, the joke here is that Casino Park and that area has now become almost 100% Korean.
Must be. Yeah.
And the interesting thing about that community, completely aware of discrimination and what people think about it, but its answer to it is not to appeal to the state. Its answer to it is to do things differently. And actually, some of that is admirable, some of it is worrisome. But the answer here is different. And that takes me on to, I know I haven't got much time, so let me take myself on to quickly what we might want to do. First, I think we need to have and develop a language that helps us to describe the landscape fully and accurately. We were talking about data earlier on. I understand what the point that people make when they say this doesn't talk about me, but that's not the point of aggregate data. That's not its job. That the qualitative experience is done in a different way. But the quantitative data is absolutely vital. And I will give you a very profound example of why this, because it was a mistake I made for many years myself. Up until 2003, we collected data on children's performance in 3 categories: black, brown, white. The distinction was made, essentially, obviously, because that's what the numbers told us, between whites and not whites. And therefore, we developed a thesis that the problem here was teacher expectation. And millions, I mean hundreds of millions, I suspect, over 20 years, went into basically telling teachers, you're racist, stop being racist. In 2003, when we started, I went to CRE, we started to disaggregate that data, and lo and behold, we discovered that children of Indian heritage were as far above the average as Pakistani Muslim children were below it. African, Caribbean, and African children, very different outcomes. You had to develop, I mean, unless you're an idiot, when new evidence turns up, what you have to do is to say, what's wrong with my theory? So we had to develop a new way of looking at it, and it changed practice. So the issue of data, I think, is absolutely essential. I've got a lot more to say, but I will make 3 quick points, Samir, and then shut up. Just in passing about the elite intervention, which I think is a lot of what we've been talking about, composed of 2 things. Your point, John, the victim narrative, and the other point being this issue of standpoint epistemology, which also applies to trans, i.e., if I think my experience, what I think about my experience is the only truth, and you have to accept it come what may. Mad. But that is leaking into the wider world. So what do we do about it? Well, 3 things. I've made my point about data. We were wrong when we had poor data. We need better data. And what we have now is better than it used to be, but it still isn't good enough. We still don't understand the story of racial difference well enough. Secondly, and this is something for this group, what the academics and the writers and the fashion people and musicians in this room do is tell stories. Well, culture is a story we tell, the story we tell about ourselves or who we want to be. And we need to write a new story. And we need a vehicle for that story. The other guys have all sorts of vehicles. I'm still surprised that we don't, for example, have a journal in which people write. And the kind of thinking that's being expressed here is on offer every month or every quarter. That's a project that I really wish we could be pursuing, because we need to tell a new story, one that corresponds to the way this country, not the United States, by the way, this country is right now, that explains why we have an Asian heritage prime minister and nobody's bothered about the fact that he's Asian heritage. That is 20 or 25 years ago. You could not imagine that to have been true. What happened? Well, nobody's telling us. That's a job for the people who tell stories in this room. And the last point I want to make is we need to change the policy narrative, and we need to do that by winning allies. And somebody talked earlier on about an alternative vision. I think the narrative that we have that is predominant now is one of atonement. Going back to my first point, the narrative about race, bluntly speaking, has now become entirely about white people and how sad they feel about what they and their ancestors have done. I really don't give a shit. The narrative now has to be about how we liberate potential of all kinds of people. We have to have a narrative of ambition rather than one of atonement. And we have to have a plan to create that. That those of you who watch Homeland will remember the great line that somebody said to the CIA. Those guys over there have got a plan. Their plan is to kill you and take your land. What's your plan? We've got to have a plan, guys.
Thank you all. I'm just going to have a brief discussion, and then I'll throw it open to everyone. John, I'm going to pick up on something that I know you didn't mention, but Alka did. Right at the beginning, she said, we're not talking about racism anymore, we're talking about anti-racism. You famously talked about the three waves. I'd like you to answer a question about that, which is, if you could briefly tell me what the three waves were, and what you see as what made each wave subside and the next one grow, and do you think there is a fourth wave? And if there is, how will this third wave subside?
That's an interesting question. The first wave is the classic anti-racist battle against formal segregation and disenfranchisement. That's the black and white newsreel anti-racism that created, for example, my middle-class black life starting in the 70s. Second wave is not anything anybody explicitly noticed at the time, but that was when America began a process of examining the racism inside of, in particular, white people. The idea that it isn't enough that a black lawyer can get a job, but also people need to examine their inner racist within them. And I think that that was a massively successful project that went from about 1970 to about 1995. That was a vast moral advance, that people be called upon to think about that, and that so many did. And that we got to the point that today, to be called a racist is equivalent to being called a pedophile. That, in a sense, is an advance. But then, third wave anti-racism is essentially what Trevor is calling this movement towards anti-racism being about white people's atonement, being about thinking of yourself as a privileged white person and that being a stain along the lines of original sin that can never change, the idea being that identifying the racism is more important than helping people who are perhaps victims of racism in the past. And the third wave anti-racism, I think, really doesn't serve black people or anybody's purpose, really, and it's a kind of self-indulgent psychosocial exercise that people are going through. And it's just riddled with insincerity. It's a terrible thing to see. What is coming next? If third wave anti-racism, as I hope, is gradually treated as the aberration and the self-involved kind of calisthenic that it is, then what's the fourth wave? What's going to be the kind of anti-racism that actually works? To be honest, I think that as time passes, the contours of the conversation are going to change because of the contrast between the reality on the ground and what Alka is calling the elites are talking about. There is too much mixture, and this may seem a crude metric, but there is too much hybridity among people. There are too many, quote unquote, mongrels in the United States, and I can tell here as well, for this conversation to make any sense in 50 years. I'm assuming it's going to move on to class, and it might even be as recreational as the debate we're having now. But talk about Flushing. I don't live in Flushing. I live in Jackson Heights, but it's practically next door. And the truth is that my girls are growing up in a circumstance where many people at this point are very earnestly and wisely telling me that because they are half white and half black, that they're really black and that I need to be raising them with an awareness of their African American identity, that I'm not giving them enough of it because I like Looney Tunes and Stephen Sondheim. And the issue is that they're supposed to be running up against a kind of racism that, say, I did 50 years ago and that the world hasn't changed. And I'm beginning to tell people they can identify however they want to, but this notion that they are Negroes because they're half me is frankly a little antediluvian, and I think a lot of the people who are telling me this, and all of them are white, are doing it as a kind of atonement. They're trying to show that they understand what racism is. I don't think my girls are going to live in a world where that makes any sense. In the neighborhood, purely white people are a minority. Socially, they do not dominate. And really, most kids in the neighborhood, as I walk my girls to school, are nothing in particular. Filipino, Jamaican, Chinese, what are they? They're just people. There's going to be more and more of that. That differs from place to place in the United States. However, it's by no means particularly centered in my neighborhood or New York City or big cities. So I think that really people are going to have to work to understand what we're talking about in, say, 50 years, because so few people will be, quote unquote, pure one thing or another. Already to an American, and I'm sure all the Americans in this room are feeling this, we have a hard time quite conceiving of what the lines are in this country. I don't know what brown is. There are so many people who are different mixtures, the dialect and how people speak and whether or not it marks what you are is different. That throws us as soon as we get off the plane. It's more and more like that in the United States as well. And so I think that's probably where it's going. And by the way, folks, I'm now going to start writing, and I want you to realize I'm not texting. That's not what I'm doing. I'm writing notes on the phone, just letting you know.
John, thank you. Very interesting, that idea that demographic change might bring about the waning of anti-racist. But let me pick up on a word that you said it was an aberration. We heard earlier this idea that the dominant paradigm of liberal thought it might be an aberration in the history of mankind. And one thing that I suppose one wonders is whether what we're facing is not an aberration, but a change in the paradigm of the way we think and the way we think we know things. And although we've discussed the elite, it's also, and I'd like Alka to address this, and we've addressed it before, it's not just the elite. Anybody who works in an organization knows that young people feel these things very strongly indeed. And one of the reasons why we accuse the elite of being cowardly is they're responding to quite a strong wave within their own staff and their own people. So it's not restricted to just the elite, it's a wave. And this wave is the next generation. So if this group was full of 17, 18-year-olds, they might just think, get out of the way, you don't understand how the world is changing. I want to ask you, Alka, dealing with students and children, do you get a sense that this is a generational change and we're just kind of trying to hold back the wave, or is it an aberration?
There's certainly a generational aspect to it. I think it's important to understand that when we say these are elite ideas, we're not saying that these belong to the people who are actually in elite positions of power or authority, although they may be. We're talking about the fact that these are ideas that justify a way of organising society where certain people have more authority and power with more or less legitimacy at different times. So that's what I mean by elite. They can be held by anybody across society. There's no determining thing. There's contingency always there because qua human beings, if we're to take the idea of freedom seriously, we are free-willed, okay? And the manifestation of our free will is exactly seen in the plurality of how we eat, how we make love, how we have families, how we organise, have meetings, etc., etc. So there's a myth about freedom that it has to be tamed or trained in some way to make it socially acceptable. I don't agree with that myth. I think that misunderstands freedom it mistakes freedom for licence, and it assumes that there's no judgment involved in freedom, and actually judgment and critical thinking and boundaries are crucial to freedom. And if we want the plurality, if we want real diversity, then we have to uphold freedom. They are two aspects of the same thing. On the generational thing, you see, I mean, it's just a fact, a sociological fact, right? We have a generation of young people who have had their educational experience formed at a time when their educators have basically given up on the project of education. Right? And not just education in the sense of, do you know Shakespeare? Do you know quadratic equations? But giving up on, another secondary function of education, which is socialization. The idea of cultural socialization, of improvement, of inculcating the dispositions and values that allow you to not diss your family values and backgrounds, but to partially separate from them, right? To enter into a wider sphere of values that you need to do if you're to, develop into an adult that is capable of living in a pluralistic society and handle diversity of opinion. So when we see the young being, genuinely upset or, unable to countenance, I think there's a message, countenance, opinions that they don't like. This isn't natural to them. We have produced them. Society, collectively, we've made them.
Sorry, I'm just getting a little note here. All right. Okay. Audience questions. Now, Trevor, I would normally come back to you, but since you had such a long talk earlier on.
He's been doing this to me for 40 years.
You don't mind if I skip? Okay, so audience questions. So what I'm going to do is, as everyone else has done, I'll take 3 or 4, and if you could be brief, good, and then I'll come for a quick response, and I'll come back to you. So let's start. No, you. I was asking you, and then I'll come to you, and then I'll come over there. Yep. And then the next round on. Yep.
Okay. Thank you. Yes. So if what is common to victim culture, regardless of how it pops up, whether that's in thinking about race or a certain sort of the expansion of mental health and, young people generally looking for a reason to retract from responsibility, I just wonder whether we can have any confidence in the state of irresponsibility being intolerable and whether that gives us some reason for hope.
To tell you the truth.
John, can I just take a few questions?
Yes.
Then I'll come back to you. Behind you. There's a person behind you. And then over there.
Hi, my name is David Bernstein. I'm a founder of a group called the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, which fights against ideology and the imposition of ideology in the Jewish world. So I'm going back to the sort of main question here of how the definition of racism have changed. It seems to me that that Sir Phillips' point about Chinese immigrants and what made them successful is really the key to what's changed. In other words, we've defined cultural commentary as a form of racism, and we've walled that off. So all you have left is systemic factors, systemic racism, and that thoughtful people gave that up at some point in the discourse. When people started to say that's racism, we said, okay, we're not going to talk about it. And I'm wondering if there is a way of that thoughtful people can reclaim the ability to talk about culture thoughtfully. Maybe one way of doing that is how Orlando Patterson, the great Harvard sociologist, does it, which is to disaggregate it to a degree. In other words, you don't just talk about quote-unquote black culture, but you talk about microcultures within these communities in a way that allows actually to have thoughtful discussions and actually solve problems. And I'm wondering if there is a discourse that we need to start rethinking and reclaiming.
Thank you. Paul.
Thanks. I wanted, it's Alistair Donald actually from Academy of Ideas. I wanted to come to John's thing on victimization because I think you said that there was a victimization mindset and that we shouldn't wallow in victimization. And I couldn't help but form the impression that the solution to that sort of situation would then be to kind of shake yourself and as an individual try and navigate your way out of that. And I agree with that. I mean, I think that's a good thing for us all to do. But it does strike me that there's a bigger problem than that that lies behind it, because if you think about the way that victimization has often been explained historically, then you might imagine that it emerged at the end of the 1960s with the defeat of some of the liberation movements and the freedom movements. It then became institutionalized through the multiculturalism of the 1980s. I mean, even now in universities, you might say that there's a kind of easier route to navigate your way to success at the end of your degree course by claiming some sort of victimization through it. So it's very much something that's been institutionalized over the last half century. And so the question I have, I suppose, is how you then go about challenging that, because it seems to me to be a lot more difficult than just kind of shaking ourselves up individually, as good as that may be.
Thank you. John, do you want to pick up on the responsibility thought?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I don't have official data on the extent to which this kind of feeling is penetrating a generation. And I've heard what Catherine has said, I've heard what you've said, Alka, but in my experience at my one school, which maybe is representative of selective universities in America, that's a subset, but in any class, it's about 1 in 15 kids who think that way. Most students are hungry for professors who think normally. Most students are afraid of that one person because if you run afoul of that one person, they cut you down in class and they write about you on social media. So what I've seen over the past 10 years, and especially over the past 3, is that there is a certain kind of professor, it's more common among the professoriate than the students, there's a certain kind of student who use that vocabulary, who hold up that torch, and you tiptoe around them because you don't wish to be called out or embarrassed. And so I'm a little bit less afraid of the generational aspect, because I think what we're seeing is that young people go into institutions, and we see that the young staff have certain ideas, but as often as not, from what I'm told, it's not the whole young staff, it's 2 or 3 people who have a certain idea and everybody else cringes in the corner and lets them have what they want. So I feel more sanguine about that generation than maybe I should, because it's really a matter of the reign of terror and most of the generation just knuckling under because they don't want to be ostracized, as young people often don't. So that's just what I was going to say there.
Just briefly, I wanted to just add something to that, which is that, I mean, I agree with that. It is a minority thing. I think two points I'd want to make. One is that I think it's important to keep a distinction between when we're talking about empirical reality and when we're talking about the discourse of. Mm-hmm. Yeah? So there is the young generation as is, and then there is a cultural norm of what different people in society should be like, right. The narrative, right? And yes, it's true, but the point that there is a minority. But the problem is within education, while this holds sway, while there is no alternative voices heard, all the rest of the children are being deprived of their intellectual and aesthetic and ethical birthright, right? So they are emerging, however they feel about woke politics or ideology, they are emerging in a less good way. You know that's why you could have Frederick Douglass and people really young writing fantastic bits of literature. You know, not every age produces a Da Vinci or a Wagner or a Frederick Douglass or Rabindranath Tagore. You know, it's when, and it links into the point Alistair, I think, was alluding to, that we have to see this as relational all the time between different factors, and there are the individuals involved, but it's not just that they're operating in a context, they are part of that context as well, right? The context doesn't exist out there independent of the individual. So we have to kind of work out where the social weights are.
Trevor, do you want to pick up on reclaiming, talking about culture?
Sorry.
Reclaiming the argument that we should reclaim the idea of being able to talk about cultural difference without being shouted down.
Well, I mean, as a statement, obviously, that's what you want to do, but I think the conversation that has to take place is how you do that. I mean, you know, none of this is totally new. The idea of a minority of activists taking a grip, you only have to read the history of 1917 to 1920 to understand what Leninism is. And if you really want to know what the important thing that's happening now, particularly in universities and the media, you've got to read Gramsci's Prison Notebooks. This is the war of position and the war of maneuver. And the only way to deal with this, because the weapons here are story and narrative and explanation, is to have a better story, a better narrative, a better explanation. I think and I'll be presumptuous and use the term we here, we need to do more than say, these other guys got it wrong. Because there are real problems that real people experience on a daily basis, and it's not just in their heads. And we have to have a better answer. And I would just like to urge everybody to spend a bit of time thinking about what our better answer might be. And if I may just make a very quick point. I mean, one of the things that I think is really problematic, this is a generational point. One of is the amnesia about why things are like they are. Because, for example, there is a clear and unarguable reason in this country why people of Pakistani Muslim heritage and their communities are devastated. It is because they came for a particular reason, which was textiles, and textile industry, nothing to do with race, it went. And nothing happened to those communities. Now, if you talk to most young people under 25, they have no idea. Literally, even the people who live in those towns. I've spent some time, what is now last year, in Lancashire, in Bolton, which was the centre of it. Even the people who live in those towns don't know that. And, you know, part of our job has to be to restore sanity and reality. And the reason I think this is so important is what's coming down the track, which is the advance of technology, and I think two particular things, driverless cars and also what's going to happen in retail, are going to have a massive asymmetric impact racially. Quarter of Pakistani Muslim, Asian, beg your pardon, men are in the transport industry. They're taxi drivers. When that thing happens, they'll be devastated. In retail, employs 4 million people in this country, disproportionately, massively disproportionately minority women. When I was President John Lewis, the cashier less, the dark shop, has no staff, is maybe 3-4 years away. There are going to be hundreds of thousands of those women gone, and that will have a racially disparate impact. We need to have an answer before that happens. Sorry, I'm going on, but I can't tell you how important I think that is.
One more round of questions briefly, please, and then a quick roundup. Here, Munira, did you want to say? Please, Munira first, then you, and then there, please.
I just wanted to ask how we should respond when we do hear clearly very racist behaviour or speech. So there have been a number of examples of private WhatsApp conversations amongst police forces in the UK which have used really outrageous language. They're private conversations, but I think everyone would agree that to hear members of the police talking in that way is pretty frightening. It's very hard to know from those conversations how widespread that is and what's going on. Whether that's representative or not. I know there are some people who have been involved with the police in the audience, can perhaps comment on it. But then you go from that to what's commonly described as a microaggression in somewhere like a university where everybody's sort of tiptoeing around race and doesn't want to cause offence, and yet some comment, some innocuous comment could be very easily misunderstood or interpreted as potentially looking like it could be racist. And you have almost these two extremes is it possible to just say racism is bad when you see it, and we should obviously condemn it and, you know, tell people that's bad, but also not assume that a comment that might be interpreted by somebody somewhere as racist isn't the worst thing, as long as their intention was not bad. I don't know if we've just lost the ability to just make a judgment and distinguish between those things, because it feels, and maybe the media is partly to blame for this, every time there is an example in the newspaper, people try and extrapolate and say, well, that shows what kind of country this is. And I think the country is just it's a mixed picture to some extent.
Yep. I know I'm now fighting between your stomachs and the continuing questions. So if you can really be brief, and then I'll get quick answers and I'll wrap up.
Hi, just very briefly then. My question is fundamentally, particularly when it comes to the generational dynamics, aren't you being a bit over-optimistic? Because I'm publishing a book, I'm a publisher, and I'm publishing a book soon by Eric Kaufman, who I'm surprised isn't here, and he's doing survey data, like big-scale survey data of universities, institutions, asking them about their attitudes on not just race, but also transgender, all these sort of issues. And actually, I mean, it's actually the idea that it's a very vocal minority who bully everybody else into it is actually not entirely true, even now. But when you look at particularly younger people who from the elite, or people who are going to university and will be running the country, you know, in 20 or 30 years' time, they genuinely believe this stuff, and in large numbers. I mean, maybe not the entire cohort, because less educated sort of people who haven't been to university, maybe not, but elite youth genuinely believe this stuff in large numbers. And when they become, you know, the next, you know, we currently have a generation of people who are running, who are maybe spineless. The 50 people in their 50s and 60s may be spineless. But when the current people who are 20 in 30 or 40 years' time are running the show, they're not spineless. They genuinely believe in it. And so I just think there's a lot of sort of, in my view, a lot of the conversations have had a lot of sort of airy liberal optimism that it's all going to be fine because we'll just debate and everyone will listen. Well, I just don't believe that's true. I believe we're in for dark times.
Okay, thank you. And last point over there.
Kind of in the same vein of what I wanted to ask. I wanted to ask sort of why particular youths from particular backgrounds kind of identify more with the newer definitions of racism than, say, people from different backgrounds and people from older generations. So for now, if I speak to my dad about what goes on, I was like, what is a microaggression? When didn't have that in my culture? But now, that's something that my generation particularly, lives and breathes. And the difference is I completely don't identify with that. I mean, I had someone call me Uncle Tom, and I was like, no, it's Auntie Esther. And then someone said they actually trying to insult me. So I don't identify with that at all. But, a large swath of members of my generation are identifying with it, and it's really hard to kind of get through to them and, make them understand, you mentioned changing the culture, but really on the ground, what does that look like? I think that's what I'm curious about.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. So wrap up. Did I think, Trevor, you were going to pick up on a question or two or something?
Well, just two quick points. One in response to the second. I was very fortunate in this respect. I grew up mostly in Guyana, and it's taken me a very, very long time. I'm very old now, and it's only in the last 4 or 5 years that I have honestly grasped that for most people of colour in this country, the opinion people who are white matters so much. I mean, literally, I never really talk about this publicly because I didn't really understand it. It's baffled me, but I've now grasped, and I'm not making this as a criticism, it's a thing that I've understood, that looming over young people's minds is what will they think about me? I've never, because of where I grew up and how I grew up, really had that as a kind of emotional response to anything. So I really get the point about, the parents saying, what are you on about? Amy Chua, who wrote Triple Package, had a really interesting point. I mean, she made a very interesting point in a talk she gave here about somebody, I think it was one of her students, Latino student, who was upset about something that somebody had said. And I don't go all the way with the Tiger Mom and all that, but she did say to this student, you're upset about that. How are you going to deal with your landlord when he throws you out of your accommodation. I think part of maybe one of the tasks I didn't mention is we need to think about ways in which we build resilience in people, rather than thinking about how we get too much into battles about who can say what and who doesn't. 10 seconds on the Munira's point, because I woke up this morning to find that the Times had confused me with Dickie Arbiter, the Queen's former press secretary, because I had said something about I'd written something about Harry and Meghan, and it strikes me that in another mind, that might have been taken as a terrible example of racism. I just think it's not. I don't think it is. I think it's just that Harry's fact checker was useless. I think one of the things we need to be doing constantly is saying, let's get in perspective. There's a ladder here. There are things that are actually about race or motivated by race, and there are things which are just stupid, shouldn't happen, but they're not about that. And that's why I say maybe we need to have something that is out there all the time, rather than just talking to ourselves.
Okay. Thank you, Trevor. All right, I'm going to give 30 seconds to Alka and the last word to John, and then I'll wrap up.
In telegraph form. We need to defend political standards of democracy, and we need to defend intellectual and aesthetic standards. I like feelings. I love my feelings. They're very personal to me. The problem is that there's been an area where feelings are educated, where feelings are brought into a conversation with reason, where as an individual you learn to objectify yourself, make yourself the object of your own scrutiny, which is not a bad thing. It's actually the basis for a democratic society. It's called a proper liberal arts education. That's what we need.
John, the last word.
30 seconds. Munira, the reason that people pretend not to understand the difference between impact and intent is because it makes you able to take advantage of the victimization mindset. You can't have the victimization mindset if you acknowledge that otherwise obvious difference. The idea that all of this is penetrating the generations because of what people say on a questionnaire, I completely understand. But I think we do need to remember that one has to be careful with what people say about, say, their racism on a questionnaire. There's what you put when you're asked a certain kind of question and the way you feel. And we may have hit a kind of a wall on this also to the young woman back there, but in terms of how prevalent this is, I work very closely with an awful lot of students by chance of a great many different kinds at Columbia, and I can honestly say I don't see it. In terms of how the usual student feels, they're afraid of that one woman or guy in the back. I can also imagine many of those students who talk to me that way filling in certain boxes on a questionnaire because that's what one is supposed to do, even watching oneself in a way. But I simply haven't seen it, and I'm going to watch out for it because, of course, we can all be in denial of certain things.
Thank you. Thank you. That's it. Let's just thank Alka, John, and Trevor for a terrifically interesting session. Thank you very much indeed.